Communism starts as a doctrine, as far as I can see. By the way, there's a great book on this, a marvelously written book, famous book by Norman Cohn called Pursuit of the Millennium. It's in paperback. He writes about these guys in loving, quote unquote, loving detail. He obviously has a proper attitude of contempt and hatred, sardonic hatred. Pursuit of the Millennium. It starts apparently with a very extremely influential, extraordinarily influential, medieval, or earlier than that, heretic, late 12th century Italian mystic Joachim of Fiora, born and lived in Calabria in southern Italy, became an abbot and also a hermit. Let's see, his 1145, 1202, late 12th century. The thing about Joachim of Fiora, you have to realize he was not just a lone nut. He was extremely influential. He almost converted a couple of popes. In other words, he was just this close to translating this to Orthodox Catholic doctrine. Basically what he said was, well, first of all, he launched apparently the idea of the prophecy, that you have to look at the Bible to find out prophecy of the end of the world, etc., concentrating, of course, on the book of Revelation. And he came to the conclusion that history was destined to move through three successive stages. There's always three, by the way, in all these things. It's very much, again, like the Plotinus thing. The first stage is unity with God, and the second stage is the alienation. This is a different version, but more advanced, so to speak. The first age was the age of the Old Testament. Okay? So we have this age 1, Old Testament. This was the age of the Father and the Holy Trinity. It was the era of the Father, or the age of the law. You have the Father and the law. Called a theonomic. Also rule by fear and servitude. The second age, ushered in by Jesus, was the age of the Son. Okay, so this is the New Testament, the age of the Son. Christian era, which is the age of faith and submission. And then there's coming inevitably and soon the third age. And this is always the age to watch out for, the age of the Holy Spirit. This is when all hell breaks loose, so to speak. The age of the Holy Spirit. The era of perfect joy, love, and freedom, and the end of human history. And, of course, the era of perfect joy and freedom is also the end of property. And nobody has any property, nobody works. See, when you envision the kingdom of God on earth, very few people talk about working. It's never part of anybody's real utopian vision. So nobody works. Norman Cohn puts it, paraphrasing Joachim of Fiora, the world will become, quote, one vast monastery in which all men will be contemplative monks wrapped continuously in mystical ecstasy until the day of the last judgment, unquote. Now, the interesting thing, the reason why this would, quote, work, unquote, because the first thing you talk about a communist utopia is who works, how do they allocate economic resources and all that stuff, who does all these things. The answer is they don't have to do any of it because all men would be pure spirit. The body will have withered away or disappeared. So everybody's pure spirit. If you're pure spirit, you have to worry about economics. You have to worry about labor, property, food. All these things disappear. Everybody's pure spirit chanting praise to God. So that sort of solved the economic problem. There ain't no economic problem because there's no bodies. Okay? Unfortunately, the other communists that came later, Marx, for example, obviously did not believe in pure spirit, and so he faced the economic problem, which Joachim avoided. So again, so you have the whole thing, the whole pre-Marxist, so to speak, era. The first age is the age of primitive communism, and then you have the second age of the Son, is the age of class conflict and class separation, and then finally you have the realm of perfect freedom, total communism, and no division of labor in the end of human history. You don't have to have any labor at all, obviously. As with many Chiliasts or messianic types, Joachim was sure the date of the advent of the third age, the final age, was going to be soon but not too soon. He didn't make the mistake of the Millerites and saying it's going to be October 22nd, 1844. It said it'll be about 50 years from now. 50 years is a good time because it makes everybody hopped up, and yet it's not soon enough so you're tested quickly by empirical reality. So he said around 1250 will be the ushering in of the third age. Now the third age will be ushered in by a cadre of vanguard, order of people who will usher in this third age, who will prepare the way and sort of lead the path here. And when the Franciscan order started around this early 13th, the rigorous Franciscan, the rigorous wing I mentioned this last night, the anti-property wing or the pro-property wing, many of them felt that they were the priori. They were the Joachimites. They're the people destined to usher in the final age. A new ingredient comes into this whole witch's brew, and I call it that. Around the same time, at the end of the 12th century, a little bit later than Joachim, the University of Paris, which in those days was the great center for theological studies, a learned professor of theology, a favorite of the French royal court, at least until he came up with this doctrine, was a fellow named Amaurian, whose followers became the Amaurians, the Amaurian movement. Amaurian doctrines were condemned by the Pope. He did not almost convert the Pope, and who forced a public recantation, and he died shortly thereafter. The Amaurians were students of theology in Paris, usually his students or students of his students. And they influenced many people and distributed many popular works of theology in the vernacular. Since most people couldn't read Latin, it was difficult to influence them in Latin, so they were propagandizing in the vernacular. Their leader was Father William Orifex. In other words, he was the Amaurian, which means gold in Latin. Apparently he was either an alchemist or a goldsmith. It's not clear. He had some professional connection with gold. At any rate, the Amaurians believed they had a very similar doctrine. They added some more spice to this. For the Old Testament, they said each age had its own incarnation, where God is incarnated in man. The first age, Abraham was the incarnation, first incarnation. The second age, of course, Jesus was the incarnation. The question is, who would be the incarnation of God in the third age? Well, obviously it was them, the Amaurians. They were the incarnation of God in the third age. It usually is, by the way, with third age types. They become the big prophet, the Messiah. Fulfill human history. End it and fulfill it. Fulfill it and end it, I should say. So they consider themselves a new incarnation. In other words, they proclaim themselves as living gods, the embodiment of the Holy Spirit. And of course they start as a divine elite, but eventually everybody will become, eventually after various tribulations or whatever, everybody will become the Holy Spirit, living gods. Current period, they were the only ones. They were the elect. Okay, in the early 14th century, 100 years later, there comes another group, various groups who were sort of decentralized, continuing this tradition called the Brethren of the Free Spirit. The Amaurians, by the way, were wiped out. No, the Amaurians were mostly wiped out. But anyway, it continues on. Bubbles underneath. The Germans call Luftmenschen. In other words, people of the wind. They're sort of like hippie types of wandering around. No fixed abode. No fixed means of support. Brethren of the Free Spirit. A whole bunch of Brethren of the Free Spirit. And they added another important ingredient, the ingredient which we mentioned with Plotinus, the reabsorption into God on the final stage. And we have the communism stuff, and then you have the reabsorption, the final unity. They also added a new elitist twist, namely that the Brethren of the Free Spirit had two types of people, of their brethren. The crude in spirit, who would have to die first, and the glorious minority, namely themselves and the leadership, who was subtle in spirit, who could and did become reabsorbed and therefore living gods in their own lifetime. In other words, they already had their own individual reabsorption, and therefore they would be eternal and gods. This minority was, of course, the brethren themselves and their leadership, who achieved the status of divinity by years of training, self-torture, visions, and so forth and so on. Became perfect gods and more perfect and more godlike than even Christ himself, you see, because Christ was back in the second stage. They're in the final stage. They're even more divine. And they also proclaim themselves greater than God himself. For example, a group of female free spirits at Schweidnitz in Germany claimed to be able to dominate the Holy Trinity, such that they could ride it as in a saddle. And one of the women declared that when God created all things, I created all things with him. I'm more than God. Anyway, also, of course, along with this, being living gods, we have an extreme form of what's known as the antinomian heresy, namely that some people are gods and it's impossible for them to sin. Anything they do can't be sin by definition, because they're already divine. And whatever they do is necessarily moral and perfect. And of course, the free spirits, like other antinomians, were tempted to demonstrate their freedom from sin by doing all sorts of sinful things. And there's a catch with the free spirits. Only minorities, I said, were divine. These were the leadership of the free spirits. The rank and file was destined to become God. They were striving to make it. They'll make it eventually. And there was only one sin for all these people. In other words, all other sins are out because they're living gods and so forth and so on. For example, Nicholas of Basel, who's one of the top free spirits, had his own cult. So the rank and file is only one sin ever. That's disobeying Nicholas of Basel. Right? Because Nicholas of Basel is God. That's it. Any disobedience, of course, is sinful and should be met by immediate punishment. So each disciple took an oath of absolute obedience to Nicholas of Basel being the living God. This is, I guess, true of most of the other free-spiriters. So in return, every member of the Nicholas of Basel group took an oath of complete obedience to Nicholas of Basel, in return for which he granted them freedom from all sin, because he was God. It was a neatly packaged circle. And what about the rest of the mankind outside the cults? Well, their role was to be exploited, used and exploited by the elect. And so along with this came an assault on the institution of private property. In other words, to them, communism was essentially theft. In other words, the idea was the elect could steal property and money from anybody, because they were the elect. They were divine, and therefore, to them, communism essentially meant everybody, your goods are my goods. So the Bishop of Strasbourg summed it up, 1317, summed up their doctrine. They believe that all things are common once they conclude that theft is lawful for them. For them, of course. I think other people stealing from them, they wouldn't look on very benignly. For example, Johann Hartmann was a free spirit abbot from Erfurt in Germany, said the truly free man is king and lord of all creatures. All things belong to him, and he has the right to use whatever pleases him. If anyone tries to prevent him, the free man may kill him and take his goods. So, free man being one of the elect. And one of the favorite sayings of the brother of the free spirit was, whatever the eye sees and covets, let the hand grasp it. It's a great moral theory. Then we have, in the early 15th century, we have the final ingredient for all this, was the extreme wing of the Taborite movement, which is itself the left wing or the radical wing of the Hussite movement, which bubbled up in Bohemia. So a pre-Protestant group in 15th century Czechia, I guess is the way to describe it, which blended, by the way, a religious struggle against the Catholic Church, nationality, Czechs versus German, class, artisans versus the patricians. So it's sort of a blend of all three of these things, the Taborite movement. The extreme wing of the Taborites added to this, they adopted all this stuff, added something else. The divine duty to exterminate all heretics, which means everybody except themselves. For the last days are coming soon, the final days, and the elect must go out and stamp out sin by exterminating all sinners. The easiest way to stamp out sin, of course, is exterminate the sinners, which means all non-Taborites at the very least. So the sinners are enemies of Christ, and quote, accursed be the man who withholds his sword from shedding the blood of the enemies of Christ. Every believer must wash his hands in that blood. Having that mindset, of course, they didn't stop at intellectual destruction. In addition to killing all non-heretics, they would burn all non-heretical things like books, images, paintings, libraries, and so forth and so on. Besides, the elect have no need for books. When the kingdom of God on earth arrives, there will no longer be, quote, need for anyone to teach another. There will be no need for books or scriptures, and all worldly wisdom will perish. I guess all people, too. There's a general destruction of everything, theft and general destruction. And, of course, again, the Taborites were going to return to a lost age, an alleged lost age of early communism. Everything was great. Society with no private property. And, of course, in order to do that, you have to exterminate the cities, which are centers of sin and avarice and luxury and greed, merchants, the landlords, and virtually everybody else. And after the elect had established their communist kingdom of God on earth in Bohemia by revolutionary means, they would then spread it to the rest of the world. Now Bohemia, today Bohemia, tomorrow the world. In addition to that, they were very consistent in communism. This is true, by the way, in communists in general, which has sort of been dropped out of the literature. Also, communism with women, personal bodies. The Taborite preachers, left-wing preachers, taught that everything would be common, including wives. There'd be no marriage, etc., etc. They found, well, the first thing, the Hussite revolution breaks out in 1419. In the same year, the left-wing Taborites got together and captured a town called Usti in northern Bohemia. They renamed it Tabor, which I guess means Jesus in the Mount of Olives or something, right? There's a New Testament reference with Tabor. And they renamed this town Tabor, and they installed Taborite communism, so to speak. They engaged in a communist experiment, owning everything in common, dedicated to the proposition, quote, that whoever owns private property commits a mortal sin, unquote. All women were owned in common, true to their doctrines. If husband and wife were ever seen together, they were beaten to death or otherwise executed. A form of execution can lead to your imagination. They also believe that they believe the unlimited right to consume from the common storehouse. They had a common storehouse. Nobody gets paid. Everybody sort of takes what they need. Except the Taborites, of course, felt they were exempt from all work, since they were divine. As a result of nobody working and everybody taking from the common store, there's not much production left. Very early, the common store disappears, and who's going to contribute to it? It's one of the great communist problems. So then, since the common store of the Taborites in Usti was gone, they decided, well, now we rob and exterminate everybody outside of Tabor. we externalize the movement, so to speak. The synod of the moderate Taborites are, of course, very much against this. They said that many communities never think of earning their own living by the work of their hands, but are only willing to live on other people's property and to undertake unjust campaigns for the sole purpose of robbing. Anyway, with alienating everybody around them, the peasants and everybody else, the Taborite, the Usti experiment quickly collapsed. It was wiped out, but again, it keeps bubbling on. The idea is picked up by other groups. One group is the Bohemian Adamites, who added another special. Each one of these groups adds their own special contribution to this great movement. The Adamites, again, like the Free Spirits, believe they were living God, superior to Christ. And one of the reasons why, get this, is the reason why they were superior to Christ, because Christ is dead and they're still alive. I think it's one of the least convincing reasons I've ever heard. At least short-sighted, certainly. Again, not only were all goods strictly owned in common by the Adamites, the marriage was considered a heinous sin. Commodity was compulsory for the Adamites. Since the chaste were unworthy to enter the Messianic kingdom, any man could choose any woman at will, and will would have to be obeyed. Also, the Adamites went around naked most of the time, imitating the original state of Adam and Eve, or the alleged original state. Also, another peculiar thing, the government, there's a famous quip that whatever, in the 20th century, whatever is not prohibited is compulsory. Well, the Adamites both made promiscuity compulsory and restricted, because it was compulsory, but only with the permission of the Adamite leader. His name was Adam Moses. And so, in order to engage in compulsory promiscuity, you have to have his permission. Again, like all these other guys, the Adamites regarded it as sacred divine mission to exterminate all the unbelievers in the world, wielding the sword as a marvelous image, I think, wielding the sword until blood floods the world to the height of a horse's bridle. Which I guess is high, something like that. They were God's scythe, sent to cut down and eradicate the unrighteous. These groups began to use the agricultural image of the scythe. I am God's scythe. And at any rate, they were finally crushed by the moderate Hussites, moderate Taborites, as you might expect. They were robbing and killing everybody they could, sallying forth a commando raid to rob and kill the unrighteous. They were finally smashed. But again, it keeps popping up, and then we get now to the Anabaptists. This is after the Reformation comes and lets loose a lot more of these people. I could easily spend the rest of the hour talking about the Anabaptists, but it's rich in rich in narrative and examples. It really starts with Thomas Munster, who was a first coercive Anabaptist or communist Anabaptist, Munter with an umlaut, who starts off as a young priest and then becomes a Lutheran, who's quite learned in the scriptures and the writing of the German mystics. Becomes a Lutheran as soon as Luther launches the Reformation in 1520. He's there. And Luther recommends him for one of the top pastorates. He then continues on. As a matter of fact, he meets a Bohemian, one of the Bohemian, who's been influenced by the old Bohemian movement, a weaver named Nicholas Storch, and Storch converts him to the old Taborite doctrine. And Minster picks it up and says, okay, I'm the prophet. And he goes from one city in Germany to another, usually getting kicked out, but getting more and more followers. And one time it's kind of funny, kind of amusing. He goes to Czechia, the heartland. So I've got to meet the Czechs. He starts preaching to them. Unfortunately, he didn't know Czech and they didn't know German, so it was a preaching failure. you might imagine. At any rate, but he keeps finding more and more support, goes to more and more towns, gets kicked out, forms a revolutionary organization called the League of the Elect. It's kind of one interesting thing. The Duke is kind of interested, heard about this guy preaching, Munster, and he goes to listen to him. The Duke is the brother of the Prince of the King of Saxony. And the Duke seems like a real dimwit to me because he's preaching his doctrine. He lays it all out. He tells the Duke and the princes have an obligation to go exterminate the unrighteous. And then he says, if they don't do it, if the princes fail in his divine obligation, then we will have to rise up. As he puts it, the sword shall be taken from them. If they resist, let them be slaughtered without mercy. Then we will rise up and slaughter all the princes and dukes. And somehow the Duke didn't realize the implications of this. He said, well, this guy's a sort of interesting preacher. He gets started. He imposes a communist regime. He takes over the town of Mulhausen, decrees all property be in common, and as one contemporary observer said, he so affected the folk that no one wanted to work. Again, the other guys will contribute according to their ability, and we'll take according to our needs. It seems to be the practical implication of all this. And they talk about love a lot, communism and love, but basically what it means is theft and general slaughter. Anyway, Munster gets wrapped up in the Peasants' War, which was a much more general thing. That's the nobility, and his wing of Anabaptist peasants gets involved in that, and he gets finally chopped up. But again, he keeps getting his body may be moldering in the grave, but his spirit went marching on. He keeps picking up disciples before he gets conked out. By the way, one of the things that Munster did is he was marching with the peasants, and here the princes and the landgraves had a huge number of cavalry and artillery, had a lot of firepower. The peasants had practically nothing, had no arms. And he tells the peasant, gives his last flaming speech, holding aloft his naked sword, Munster, and he says, "Don't worry about it, because God had personally promised me victory, and he would catch all the enemy cannonballs in the sleeves of his cloak, and God would protect them all." Just at the strategic moment that he spoke, just as he got to the peroration, a rainbow emerged in the sky, and the rainbow is considered the symbol of his movement, sort of like an early rainbow coalition. And that was it. That was a sign that he would be triumphant. Of course, the whole gang was slaughtered. Peasants, him, whole business. But anyway, he misinterpreted the sign, I guess. And so other followers popped up, and finally we get town. They get a town, of course, around about. They get a real city. 10,000, which is a big city in those days. They get a city in northwestern Germany called Münster. I have difficulty myself distinguishing between Münster and Münster. But anyway, Münster was dead by this time, and Münster was the final, I think, a year's experiment in compulsory communism. This is 1530s, I think, 1532, 3, 4, in that period. Sort of the climax of the compulsory Anabaptist movement. And when they capture Münster, all the good guys, so to speak, leave. They have to leave. In fact, they're expelled. Well, first of all, some of his hopped up theoreticians said, let's kill them all. Kill all Lutherans, all Catholics. And Münster, a gleam of rationality entered the head of it. There were two heads of it, one named Mathis, the other one named Bachelsen. After Mathis died, Bachelsen takes over as his assistant. Bachelsen is also known in history as Jan of Leyden, also called himself King Bachelsen. Anyway, so rationality takes over among these people. They say, no, we won't kill them more. It might anger some of them, everybody else in Germany and Europe. Let's just drive them out. They expel them in the middle of a snowstorm, forcing them to leave all their clothes, property, and money behind. Very reminiscent of the Cambodian Pol Pot regime in Cambodia. Just compulsory expulsion during a snowstorm. And so the good guys left, and the bad guy, every nut in Northern Europe, every course of Anabaptists flocked to Münster. This is it. This is the New Jerusalem. And the idea was that all the from Münster will flow outward, and everything else will be destroyed, and all the world will become one great Münster. So they all flocked in there, the whole different followers of different groups, the Melchiorites and the Rothmanites and a whole bunch of people. They all flocked to this great center. Anyway, so the first thing, of course, the compulsory communism is also one of the true things they did immediately. Bachelsen and Mathis and Bachelsen, they compulsorily outlawed money, use of money, which was also done in Cambodia. The best way to get control over a population is to outlaw money. In other words, they confiscate all the money. From then on, anything which you receive by the ration in kind of the beloved elect. In the name of equality. It's all equality, of course, but some are more equal than others, as we well know. And the elect were running everything. The elect decides who gets how much food and whatever. It's about imagined situation. Because you can't really have total totalitarianism unless you abolish money and the state then provides you with according to their wisdom and largesse and benevolence, right? The money, by the way, was all confiscated and used for Bachelsen and his cadre to buy stuff from the outside world. So first they expel any Catholics, Lutherans, or whatever else was around. There was also, for a while, this compulsory marriage of only the elect, and then there was a little bit of rebellion against that. So he finally said, okay, we swung to the other side, about 3 months, moved from compulsory marriage to compulsory promiscuity for everybody. Communism of women again came in. But she took to like a duck takes to water, as a matter of fact. He immediately, very, very quickly had 13 wives, I think. And thereby unifying theory and practice. Anyway, Mathis, by the way, the reason how Mathis was the original absolute leader of this group, he got filled with too much hubris, and he was convinced that Easter, that God had ordered him and a few people to rush out and defeat the bishop's armies. And he rushed out there, and of course they were both all hacked to pieces. Bachelsen then becomes the king. He had himself proclaimed king, by the way. So Bachelsen said, don't worry, people, God will give you another prophet who will be more powerful, which of course was himself. Anyway, at one time, by the way, when he instituted his new rule, Bachelsen, he ran through the streets of Münster naked in a frenzy, falling then into a silent 3-day ecstasy. And he rose on a third day, as some certain other person did, and announced to the populace a new dispensation had been arrived at, which was that God had revealed to him that he was now going to take over. He abolished the previous town offices and had himself proclaimed elder and king and all that. And he would pick all the elders and all the rest of it. By the way, for any act disagreeing, any act whatsoever, I mean, there's a litany of stuff and go on and on. Any act, disobedience to Dockelson, price, using money, disobeying any kind of edict, including, by the way, lying, avarice, and quarreling, death penalty, immediate death penalty of everything. It's total, death penalty, anything, quarreling, nagging, anything with death penalty. So the great age of capital punishment. There's also compulsory polygamy, because most of the men had left, leaving the wives and children behind. So it was about 3-to-1 ratio of women and men most of the time. So compulsory polygamy was at least technologically feasible. And by the way, here's the great thing. I'll wind up Bachelson on this note. He starts with equality and poverty and all that. He winds up with he takes all the confiscated money, transforms it into gold and jewelry, and he and his court, he and his queen and his nobles, whatever they call themselves, they elect all fantastic luxury stuff, living in fantastic luxury while everybody else was literally starving, totally desperate. And his reason for this, because a few people I guess were a little bit edgy about this, how do you explain here we have absolute equality, absolute communism, how come these guys are living in luxury? So this explanation was very interesting. It was, since we are now gods, we're now pure spirit. Therefore, none of this means anything to us. You see, we've risen above pure material objects, so we're not really enjoying it or whatever. If you can buy that one, I got a Brooklyn Bridge up there to sell you too. So at any rate, at long last, the bishop and everybody, finally, the siege was, although it lasted until the very end, it was only betrayed by a few informers, and they finally got into the town and slaughtered, of course, the whole Bachelson movement, not too much ado. So that was the end of compulsory communist experiments. But the thing we have to remember is that left liberal historians and Marxist historians dealing with this issue, how do they react to these people? I mean, any rational person would react in total horror to the Bacelsonian movement. They love them. They're great people. Why do they love them? Well, one, they were communists. No question about that. They believe in communism. They carried out. And two, there was a mass movement, a popular movement of the people. No question about that either. Most of these people were some real life's losers. So no question about the fact there's a lower class movement, a working class movement, peasant movement, whatever you want to call it, and as Marx would have called, I guess, should have called a lumpen proletariat movement of marginal types, and it was communist movement. Therefore, it's great. It's really kind of interesting to read left-wing historians talking about these people. They love them. It's setting stage for the rest of the history. Communism again pops up again. This sort of discredited compulsory communism and Anabaptism for most people by this time. It pops up in the French Revolution, just before the French Revolution, as things are being overturned in general. And we have a secularized version of this. But not all secularized. We know, of course, that Marx was an atheist, but there was a real conflict, a real dispute until the very end, until 1848, really, at the time of the Communist Manifesto, a real dispute between Christian communists and atheist communists. They both really agree on everything except the groundwork. The atheist version, the secularized version, of course, we know about, it's all secular, and the communist version, which was the Christian version, which was that they are the prophet, the same stuff we're talking about. Just do a little bit on that. One problem, of course, the atheist communists had is what we call the agency of social change. It was, how is this brought about? How's communism being brought about? For post-millennial types, it's easy. God brings it about through history. It's inevitable. The Messiah returns or the prophet returns and brings it about. For atheists, however, we have a real problem. How is this brought about? Since you can't rely on God or the third age anymore, who's going to bring it about? And most socialists are communists. By the way, socialism and communism was very billowing all throughout Europe in the 1830s and 40s. All sorts of socialist groups, Owenites, Fourierites, a whole bunch of stuff. But anyway, all these people said, well, we educate the public, essentially educationists. But that, of course, was not suitable for Marx. Marx wanted to show it was inevitable, quote, scientific, unquote. It's got to come about, it's inevitable, decreed by history. And of course, bringing in Hegelianism, alienation, and dialectic is allowed to do it. He found his alleged inevitability, which gave him a leg up on everybody else, who was kind of rely on people's will. There were also communist groups in the 17th century Civil War in England. I'm going to pass them by quickly. Fifth Monarchy men and the Diggers and so forth. And the two big philosophic communists, so to speak, before the French Revolution, Mabley and Morelli. Mabley was a aristocrat, and interestingly enough, the brother of the great laissez-faire utility theorist, Condillac. His name was Mabley de Condillac or something. Mabley was was an aristocrat, of course, and spent most of his time, he wrote it, I guess, 1709 to 85. He wrote in the 1750s, I believe. And he wrote a lot of stuff. It was Alexander Gray. By the way, when we get to socialism, there's a whole bunch of books I could recommend. One of the great works is by Alexander Gray. Witty, perceptive, sardonic, full of socialist tradition. He's also very good on Ricardo and so forth. There's another book. He has two books. One is called Development of Economic Thought, which is a short book by Gray, which deals very well with Smith, Ricardo, etc., and a larger book called The Socialist Tradition. He wrote from 1930s to 50s. So what he says about Mabley he says Mabley's works are, quote, deplorably numerous and extensive, unquote. He's extremely prolific, tangled kind of stuff. He wrote his collected works. It was very popular, though, at the time. Collected works range from 12 to 26 volumes, depending on the edition, which came out in 4 different editions after he died. In other words, he died in 1785. By this time, the French Revolution was coming out. 4 different editions of a 30-volume work. It's extremely popular. Anyway, Mabley was an egalitarian. He believed that all men are perfectly equal and uniform. All men are one and the same everywhere, totally uniform. He professed to discern this alleged truth in the laws of nature. And he advocated communism. His problem was, of course, the problem, who does the work? Or as it used to be said in my day, who brings it, under socialism, who carries out the garbage? If property is owned in common and each person is equal, who's going to contribute to the common store? He had some solutions to it. One solution, by the way, which was quite prominent in the New Left period, for those who did recognize the economic problem, that is, you tighten your belt, you reduce your desires and wants. In other words, there's a big gap. If communism is producing very little, you just desire less. Sort of the mystical or the Indian solution or whatever, Buddha's solution. It's not a solution that appeals to me, I'll tell you that. The other solution was the solution of Mabley. He went through logically all these possible solutions of the economic problem under communism. They, of course, did not talk about the calculation debate. That was, of course, Mises' contribution much later. Another one was, well, we give them ribbons or medals. This is the Che Guevara, Mao Zedong solution. You don't give them more money because everybody's equal. We give them a lot of ribbons, hero of the socialist revolution medal, and things like that. That would provide the incentive to do the work. Got a quote from Alexander Gray, a magnificent critique of this. He says, the idea of the world may find its driving force in a birthday honors list. In other words, the king's birthday honors list. Giving the king, if necessary, 365 official birthdays in the year. Occurs with pathetic frequency in the more utopian forms of socialist literature, although perhaps few are so badly bitten with the notion as is Mabley. So Mabley calls them distinctions. You give, higher, bigger medals for more work and so forth. And Gray said, but obviously if any were wise or depraved enough to say that they preferred indolence to a ribbon, there would be many such. They would have to be allowed to continue to lead idle lives, sponging on their neighbors. Perhaps some who at last attain the ribbon might burst into a blaze of laziness, in order they might without distraction savor the pleasure which accompanies this consideration. Mabley's world, in short, is one which is expected that work will be done by all, without intermission, in the hope of a distinction to come, or in gratitude for a distinction already received. He then goes on to say that as you hand out more and more distinctions, the value of each distinction becomes less. If every third guy down the block has a medal, what good is it? And then he says, further he says, Mabley does not say how or by whom his distinctions are to be conferred. It is assumed, and always is assumed, says Gray, that there will be universal and unquestioning belief that the fountain of honor has sprayed its refreshing waters on all the most deserving and are none but the most deserving. This naively innocent faith does not exist in the world as we know, nor is it likely to exist in any earthly paradise that many may imagine. And so then he says, a general or a civil servant kept waiting unduly in the queue for the night of the bath may find his youthful ardor replaced by the sourness of hope deferred and zeal may flag. In other words, you might start resenting the fact that this guy down the block's got his ribbon, I ain't got my ribbon, the hell with it. And Mabley, of course, does not consider these natural human traits. Anyway, but at bottom, Mabley was a realist. And he said, it's not going to work. He said, I love communism. Basically, he said, there's no hope for its victory because they won't be able to, man is not good enough to solve this problem, to be a new socialist man, as the Marxists would later say. So he was basically a pessimist, and therefore not really inspire or stimulate the revolutionary communist movement. But on the other hand, you had Morelli, whom we don't know his first name, an unknown figure, writing in 1755, and a Frenchman who, again, a work that went into 5 editions in a few years. Morelli was an optimist. No, we can't establish, man will be good enough to establish communism. Because man, this is of course a Rousseauan or a vulgar Rousseauization thing. All men are good and beautiful and benevolent, will work hard in direction and so forth. Only institutions are evil, especially of course the institution of private property. how you can have evil, institutions are created by good men, how they can be evil, is something none of these guys ever talk about. Inner contradiction. So for Morelli, the administration of the communist utopia would also be easy. And this is the beginning by way of Lenin's famous statement, all you have to do to administer resources is be a record keeper. Which Lenin, you don't need entrepreneurs, you don't need allocators, all you have to do is sort of list stuff, like a bookkeeper. And Morelli, I guess, originated this idea. Well, you just have a minister of labor and he just enumerates everything, lists things and lists persons, and that's it. That's all you need. But then he says, being a pessimist on human nature, even though an alleged optimist, was chiefly prepared to employ brutally coercive methods to keep all of his so-called good citizens in line. He recognized the fact that most of these good people are not going to do the proper amount of work. And so coercion comes in very, very heavily with Morelli. There's no private property, of course. Every person is to be maintained and employed by the public. Every man will be forced to work and contribute to the public storehouse, work according to his talents. Marriages are compulsory, and once again we have this whole thing, it's a compulsory personal life. Children will be brought up not only communally, but absolutely identically in food, clothing, and training. You have to assume, of course, that all people are identical before you can really do this. All nurses, all governesses, whatever, are all identical. And also, no differences in doctrine will be tolerated. Philosophical and religious doctrine is absolutely prescribed. No difference is tolerated. Children not to be corrupted by any, quote, fable story or ridiculous fictions, unquote. No fairy tales, no fiction at all. The fiction might be unsound. All trade or barter is to be forbidden by inviolable law. All buildings are to be the same. He goes into this whole architectural thing. Everybody's got to live in the same barracks, grouped in equal block. All clothing to be made out of the same fabric, etc., etc. All occupations assigned by the state. Anybody attempting to change these laws will all be sacred and inviolable forever, eternal. Anybody trying to change them or advocating changing them is to be isolated and incarcerated for life. Again, I'm going to quote Gray as a sort of summing up, talking about all these guys, Morelli, and all the socialist communist utopias, including Marxism. He says, viewing them as a group, we have here writers who set out to describe the ideal state and to reveal its functioning through ideal institutions. And in all cases, we're sure there never was such a happy population. Yet, in fact, no utopia has ever been described in which any sane man would, without any conditions, consent to live if he could possibly escape. During the French Revolution, the Babeuf movement becomes now a key thing as an organized movement to achieve, a revolutionary communist movement to achieve these ideals. Caius Gracchus Babeuf, The Conspiracy of the Equals. By the way, and all this stuff is an exciting book on the history of the movements and socialist movements and their interconnections and ramifications. He's not totally sound in all the theories he's talking about, but he's excellent on history of all these. He has footnotes in about 8 different languages. That's James Billington, called The Fire on the Minds of Men. Huge book, massive work, and he shows how each of these people influence each other and pops up in different places, sets up a revolutionary movement, and some excellent stuff, and some very obscure but important communist characters in the 1830s and 40s. Babeuf, as I say, was an organized leader. Like Babeuf was the organizer, or Lenin, so to speak, of this movement during the French Revolution, 1790-93, that whole period. Perfect equality, perfect communism, etc., etc. Abolition of property, communal storehouses, all the rest of it. And by the way, there'd be a cadre of superiors because they'd have to be running everything, obviously, in this equal setup, which he admits. Everybody's controlled from birth to death. And he's very strong on punishments. All the punishments were described in loving detail by Babeuf. What's going to be done to the dissenters and heretics and people who disobey orders. All meals will be eaten in public in every commune. Compulsory attendance for everybody, for all community members, and he can't travel without permission of the administration, etc., etc. He's also against private entertainment, be strictly forbidden, quote, lest imagination released from the supervision of a strict judge should engender abominable vices contrary to the common weal, unquote. That takes care of that. All divine revelation, because he's an atheist communist, would be banned by law, no belief in it. Anyway, he added to, as an organizer of the movement, rather than a theoretician so much, he said that we have to complete the French Revolution by a total upheaval, bouleversement total, total upheaval and total destruction of all existing things. So that out of this a new and perfect world could then rise up out of this total rubble. As usual with these guys, the destruction was fairly clear. The new and perfect world was kind of cloudy. It'll emerge eventually. As Babeuf wrote the Plebeian Manifesto, which is sort of the ancestor of the first manifesto, ancestor of the Communist Manifesto by about 50 years, he winds up in his Plebeian Manifesto, he says, may everything return to chaos, and out of chaos may there emerge a new and regenerated world. As Alexander Gray comments on this, he says, what is desired is the annihilation of all things, trusting that out of the dust of destruction a fair city may arise. And buoyed by such a hope, how blithely would Babeuf bide the storm. Okay. The key to Marx was, I discovered that I was trying to read through Marxism and working in my book, and trying to winnow out from the 10 million words that have been written on Marx and by Marx, what it's all about. I finally came to the conclusion that the key is that Marx was a commie. Now this, you might think this is a fairly trivial conclusion, but it isn't, because I haven't read the Soul book, which has been highly touted. I understand that he doesn't even mention the fact that Marx was a commie. This is a key. Tells something about the book. Because Marx starts as a millenarian communist, atheist version. And then he tries to find the handle. He's not interested in convincing people and all the rest of it. He wants to come to the conclusion that it's inevitable. Nature is the creed or whatever, it's going to come inevitably. And that's the so-called scientific aspect, scientific socialism against utopian. It's scientific, quote-unquote, because the inevitable laws of history decree that will come about. And morality then becomes swinging in with the inevitable. It's not that Marx is anti-morality, it's the moral meant anything which furthers the communist revolution, inevitable revolution, and the immoral is that which blocks it, or stops it, or restrains it, I should say. So it's the idea of mankind to help along the inevitable. It's Marx's famous metaphor of become the midwife of history. As Alexander Gray points out, a lot of obstetrical metaphors in Marx. So Marx starts off as a commie, then he tries to find the handle of why it's inevitable and what's going to come about. And the handle consists of an integration, I think a very interesting integration, of Hegelian, the alienation stuff. He starts off in life as a left Hegelian, the dialectic, alienation, and all the rest of it. And later on, trying to find the economic handle, he gets to the class struggle and alienation and and proletariat and class conflict. And then with the class conflict stage, why does capitalism inevitably emerge in a socialist revolution, communist revolution? And then reliever theory of value comes in very late in this thing as part of a handle and theory of crisis and all that, the impoverishment of the proletariat, to show why it is that the proletariat will rise up and smash the capitalist class. One thing, the capitalists become fewer and fewer, and workers become larger and larger, and then it becomes fairly easy to do it. The key was that he was a communist, and his vision was how do you achieve ultimate communism. Now, the interesting thing is that Marx didn't publish the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, and much of this was did not get published in his lifetime, and also Engels didn't publish it. Engels lived on for 12 years or so after Marx, and tried to publish Das Kapital, Capital, which was also unfinished. He never published this stuff. In fact, it never got published until, I think, 1930s. And so Marxism grew up in Europe, not knowing anything about the communist stuff, about so-called humanist aspects of Marx, or Hegelian aspects. Kautsky, who became Engels' anointed leading disciple, Karl Kautsky in Germany, didn't know that Marx had any moral theory at all. He just thought that Marx was scientific and an economist, and tried to bring in some morality, I think Darwin or something like that. But he didn't know anything about this. So the question is, why did Marx and Engels suppress the publication of this material, the so-called early Marx, the humanist? Humanist, I think, he said it was a certain amount of sardonic aspect to it. And we'll see, I think, why it's true, because I don't think anybody would have bought it. Not too many communists or proletarians would have bought the whole package if they knew about it. After the humanist stuff came out in the 1930s, etc., and Marxists began to look at it, then it became sort of a conflict between the so-called humanist Marxists. By that time, the labor theory of value was becoming discredited. Very few Marxists now believe in labor theory of value. Even Joan Robinson and people like that have abandoned it. And then they started latching on to the alleged humanist early Marx. Alienation, all this sounds very trendy, etc. Not quite realizing that's even more totalitarian than the so-called scientific economist Marx, or maybe realizing it. At any rate, and so there was a split. Althusser and Sweezy and these people said, no, the early stuff was irrelevant. He wasn't really a humanist. Basically, there was only one Marx, and the one Marx is pretty monstrous, and it's a combination of the communist vision, the humanist vision, plus the later stuff, the economic stuff, which is essentially trying to find a route toward the inevitable communism. Books on all this. I will suggest one of them, which I think is a brilliant work by Robert C. Tucker, called Philosophy and Myth in Karl Marx. It deals with the communist part and how Marx arrived at it, and the Hegelianism and so forth and so on. There's some other pretty good stuff. Bruce Maslish, of all people, who's sort of a Freudian psychobabble historian, has a very good book on the meaning of Karl Marx. Came out a year or two ago. But I'm going to start even earlier with Karl Marx. I think it's just as important. It's just been neglected, even by Tucker. There's some of this. It's not realized that early Marx, before the humanist before the economic philosophical manuscript, before even the official communism in 1843-44, Marx begins life as a messianic Christian. This has been totally overlooked. And we all know that Marx was of Jewish descent, and his father converted to Lutheranism, a sort of very modest form of Lutheranism as a sort of compulsory conversion shortly before Marx was born. But what has not been realized that Marx was in high school was a Christian, dedicated Christian of some sort, and also his school graduation essay in high school in 1835 was on an assigned topic, but he was quite ardent about it, called the Union of the Faithful with Christ. And in this union, and he talks about, I think there's certain hints of the Hegelian messianic stuff, of the unity of the blob. He talks about the mystical necessity for union with Christ to end God's rejection of man. This is already not really Orthodox Christian, as far as I'm concerned. It's beginning this whole alienation reunion stuff. Very early. In other words, he was 17 years old at that point. He also wrote in the late 30s and early 40s while he was a student at the University of Berlin, I'm learning about Hegel. He also wrote some poems, which I think is very revealing. I really think they sort of foreshadow Marx's broad system. Poems have not been stressed by historians. Maslich talks about it, and Robert Payne in his book, The Young Karl Marx, talks about them. I'm going to read you a couple of stanzas from the poems. I think they're very significant. The basic emphasis in these poems was usually it's been dismissed by historians as well, just romantic trash or whatever. I don't think it's so trash. I think it's really pretty revealing. Basic themes of these early Marxian poems were: one, megalomania, the desire of Marx for total omnipotence, and two, hatred of God for being greater than he is, basically. In other words, for creating the world as he didn't. And again, therefore, for the destruction of the universe. So I'll quote you a few things. This is from his poem, Feelings. The hatred of God of creation. For example, he said, I hate all the gods. Anyway, in his poem, Feelings, has the following two stanzas. Worlds I would destroy forever, since I can create no world. Since my call they notice never. Heaven I would comprehend, I would draw the world to me. Loving, hating, I intend that my stars shine brilliantly. And by the way, Bakunin, who was a communist anarchist at the time, I think it's important here, retorted Bakunin to Voltaire. Voltaire's famous phrase, Voltaire was sort of a skeptical atheist, I guess. There's a difference between militant atheists and skeptical atheists. And Marx was a militant atheist, as was Bakunin. Voltaire's famous phrase was, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to create him. Bakunin's retort to that, I think, is even more interesting and revelatory. Namely, if God did exist, it would be necessary to destroy him. I think you should ponder that for a minute, because I think that's behind much of militant atheism. At any rate, particularly interesting is a poetic drama called Ulanem, which Marx wrote. The hero is Ulanem, and Ulanem has a soliloquy in which he pours out his hatred for the universe. I shall howl gigantic curses on mankind, as it is, having no purpose save to happen, to be ruined, so that there should be something to ruin. If there's a something which devours, I'll leap within it, though I bring the world to ruins. The world which floats between me and the abyss I will smash to pieces with my enduring curses. I'll throw my arms around its harsh reality. Embracing me, the world will dumbly pass away. And then sink down to utter nothingness, perish with no existence. That would be really living. It's an interesting inner contradiction, as the Marxists would say. You really live and you destroy the whole world. The leaden world holds us fast, and we are chained, shattered, empty, frightened, eternally chained to this marble block of being, and we are the apes of a cold god. And finally, my final phrase here is in a poem called The Fiddler. He says, with Satan I have struck my deal. He chalks the signs, beats time for me. I play the death march fast and free. I like the free part. I think it's very revelatory, considering Marx's later doctrines and so forth. Thirst for destruction with a new world somehow vaguely emerging afterwards. Just one other quote on communism before we leave it, on the idea of unity of all people, unity of God, etc. I mentioned Chesterton's critique of Annie Besant last night, and I found that Annie Besant was a Fabian socialist and a theosophist, sort of a neo-Buddhist. Chesterton writes, according to Mrs. Besant, the universal church is simply the universal self. It is the doctrine that we are really all one person, that there are no real rules of individuality between man and man. She does not tell us to love our neighbor, she tells us to be our neighbors. The intellectual abyss between Buddhism and Christianity is that for the Buddhist or theosophist, personality, it means individual personality, is a fall of man. For the Christian, is the purpose of God, the whole point of his cosmic idea. I think that sets it off very nicely. As I say, I think the labor theory value and all that stuff is all peripheral to Marx's basic thrust. His aim of the withering away of the state, which has attracted, I guess, some libertarians, what he did is he took the phrase even, famous phrase of what was supposed to exist in communism of the government of men should be replaced by the administration of things, is really a phrase coined by French libertarian theorist Charles Dunoyer. They were talking about the withering away of the state into a laissez-faire world, a market world, in which there will be no government, just administration of things. There it makes sense. It makes no sense. One of the reasons it makes no sense in the communist version of it is because instead of having private ownership, you have communal ownership. So some kind of communist makes some of the decisions for allocation of resources. Of course, he assumes in communism there'll be superabundance, and you don't have to really worry about it. If there isn't superabundance, then somebody's got to allocate, and the whole world then allocates in some resources in some way. And of course, what you inevitably have is a group of people calling themselves representatives of the proletariat or whatever, and actually doing the allocating. You're back to exploitation of man by man, etc. So once you assume a one world communal collective ownership, you don't really wither away the state, although you can call it the People's Statistical Bureau and not a state. This is, by the way, what Colonel Gaddafi does in Libya. People don't really know it. According to Colonel Gaddafi, there is no government in Libya. There's only a People's Statistical Bureau and a People's Statistical Congress. Okay. So you can call the thing anything you want, but the state under any other name will smell as lousily. Another key thing of Marx's vision of communism, you can't leave without that. The key thing about communism, there is no division of labor. The division of labor is smashed. Alienation is the division of labor. It's key part of alienation. The unity of man with man means everybody does everything. Everybody's sort of all-around dilettante. And Marx's famous phrase in the critique of the Rothbard program, everybody will spend 2 hours in the morning, being an artist, another 2 hours working in the field, another 2 hours doing this, and then becoming a critic, another 2 hours. And that's life is sort of one big dilettante paradise. He said the cattle will be reared for 2 hours in the evening, to which Alexander Gray retorts the cattle might have some objection to that. Casual upbringing 2 hours in the evening. So the division of labor has been the key to the concept of communism, the end of the division of labor. One of the reasons, I really can't leave this, one of the reasons why I think Marx did not publish any of this stuff, and Engels didn't either, is because Marx admitted, I found this very interesting and surprising, after the proletarian revolution, the great marvelous proletarian revolution, communism comes in two stages, not just the socialist and communist stage, which is the Stalinist vulgarizing of it. The first stage, the dictatorship of the proletariat, is what he calls raw communism. This is before you get the higher communism, the ultimate communism with its communal ownership and everybody's happy and so forth and so on. And in raw communism, his description of raw communism is pretty horrifying. In other words, it would be difficult, I think, to inspire a proletarian communist movement. But the first stage is raw communism, which he says is inevitable. He says that raw communism will be the acme of human greed and envy. He says everything the anti-communists talk about when they talk about communism. Envy run rampant, universal destruction, and so forth and so on. And he says that about raw communism, so it's egalitarian, and envy will run rampant. And again, you have communism women coming in. He says in the same way as women is to abandon marriage for general prostitution, in other words, universal prostitution, so the whole world of wealth, that is the objective being of man, is to abandon the relation of exclusive marriage with a private property owner for the relation of general prostitution with the community. And he says it's really a monstrous setup. The personality of man will be negated. As he says, general envy, constituting itself as power, is the disguise in which greed reestablishes itself and satisfies itself, etc., etc. But then, his description of a communist world, at least the first stage, is just as horrifying as any anti-communist description of it. But then you see what happens is with the Aufhebung, the magic dialectic, it's suddenly transcendent, and bingo, you get into the world of pure communism and harmony and all that. I think it's very, I don't think anybody's going to sort of commit their lives to raw communism, and I think that's one of the reasons why he and Engels never published it. At any rate, so there's no division of labor, and in the world of Joachim of Fiora and everybody's pure spirit, you can sort of see how it might work. It would not work in a world of where bodies are around as an economic problem. By the way, Paul Craig Roberts, before he became a supply sider, wrote two very good books on this, Alienation and Marxism and something else. He describes key to alienation being eradication and division of labor. That's the key to one of Marxist goals. And what happens is when communists took over in Russia, as Roberts points out, they try to establish war communism, eliminate money and so forth and so on, so-called war communism, try to establish it. It didn't work. And Lenin, being a supreme pragmatist, said, step back, fellas, and then reestablish capitalism during the 1920s. Well, I'll say one thing about the theory of value here before I leave Marx. If you read Das Kapital, first volume, forget it, I mean, there's all the contradictions between first and third volume and all that. Just read the first volume, first 3 pages will tell you all. He starts off by saying, products exchange at certain prices. Okay? What determines these prices? What determines these values? And he says, well, what is it? First of all, he says values are equal. Okay? The first mistake. Since the price of something is equal to something else, since the Wonder Bread costs $1.09 a loaf, this means that somehow the loaf and the bread are an equal value. And the bread and the money are equal value, or something else is $1.09 a loaf, or $1.09, that's equal value. So he immediately says there's an equality of value. So that's the first mistake, since as we know, Austrian subjectivism is the fact there's any exchange at all means there must be an inequality of values. Both parties value the product unequally. In other words, if I buy a newspaper for a quarter, it's not that I value the quarter equally with the newspaper, or a newsstand deal doesn't value them equally. Otherwise, why bother exchanging at all? What's the point of exchanging if it's both the same thing anyway? So the point is that both have a reverse inequality. I value the newspaper, getting the Washington Post or whatever, higher than I do my quarter. The newsstand dealer, of course, values the quarter higher than keeping the Washington Post. And we have a double reverse inequality of values. This creates the condition for exchange, for profitable exchange for both parties, or both parties benefit. So there's no equality of value, quite the opposite. There's a double inequality. It's the first problem in Marx's formulation. Then he says, well, they have equality of value between these two things which have the same price. So what is equal about them? What is there in these things which are equal? They're not of equal weight, that can't be it. Not of equal volume, that can't be it. He finally works to the thing, it must be equal quantity of labor, after a certain exegesis. And at that point, you really don't have to read the rest of it, because you have about 4 or 5 fallacies all piled on top of each other. And then, of course, there's a problem. How do you get, how do you arrive at different prices that have same quantity of labor and all the rest of it? There's a whole bunch of problems with labor theory of value, which I need not go into. Von Bauwerk had a famous refutation of Marx's theory of value and theory of prices, which is available in addition, a separate edition. I think it's called Karl Marx and the Close of His System. Unfortunately, what happens is always when Marx is refuted, the Marxists have a fallback position. So it's very much like a religious cult. You have a fallback. If Marx makes a whole bunch of predictions or a whole bunch of statements which turn out to be wrong, he then changes the terms of the argument. He say, well, he didn't really mean that. And so Marx obviously meant to explain the price system by his labor theory of value. But it turns out he couldn't explain it. The Marxists say, well, he didn't really mean prices. He just meant value in some mystical inherent sense. It had nothing to do with prices. So that's one way of wash that out. So it means you can't really refute it at all. A second thing, Marx's famous prediction of why it is we'll have a inevitable proletarian revolution, that the workers get worse and worse off, the impoverishment of the working class, and they finally rise up in desperation. So it's obvious through history, and as the 19th century and 20th century proceeded, the workers are getting better and better off. So it doesn't just refute Marx's key prediction about why proletarian revolution is inevitable. So the Marxist fallback position was he didn't mean absolute impoverishment, he meant relative impoverishment. He meant that the workers, even though they might be much better off than they were 50 years ago, are still less well off than Rockefeller or Bunker Hunt. So, so you change the terms. I can't see anybody really engaging in bloody revolution, committing your life to bloody revolution because you only have one swimming pool instead of 5. Somehow that's the so-called relative deprivation. This is, by the way, the gimmick by which you always have a huge number of people under the poverty line. You keep redefining the poverty line. You say poverty doesn't mean subsistence, it memes whatever. TV sets, if you don't have a TV set, they're not called under the poverty line. And so you keep pushing the so-called poverty line up, so you always have at least a third of the population impoverished. You can never eliminate poverty because there's always some guy with five yachts instead of 1. So, by the way, somebody asked me about Tom Sowell's book on Marxism. I think it's a highly inflated work. Not only doesn't he talk about communism, which is the key, he also criticizes von Bauwerk and absolute deprivation from the same Marxist positions. He takes the Marxian line that he didn't really mean it, and it's really not, he really means relative deprivation. He wrote the book when he was still a Marxist, which is what happened. If you look at Sowell's footnotes, there's nothing after about 1965, which is the key to the composition of the book. He sort of took the book, he's now a big shot, he slapped together a book and call it, and take your old notes and your old whatever and articles and you slap it together and publish it. It's not unique to Sowell, sort of process. I got to talk about 19th century America and postmillennialism. Okay, it's a short course in American history, and it's very important. In the early 19th century, 1820s approximately, the Pietist movement develops. Before that, I wouldn't say that it's too extreme to say Christianity died out in the United States, but it almost did. In other words, most Christians were now Unitarians of some sort. Christianity was sort of dying out. And I don't know if it died out in Europe. In Europe, Pietism also begins around the same period. And for example, the founding fathers were all deists. Even George Washington is always held up as a great Christian. He's not a Christian at all. He's a deist. Actually, of the founding fathers, the only ones who were really Christian were the older ones. And Sam Adams and Patrick Henry, who were a little older than the rest, who were still Calvinist Christians. The others were all sort of, I'd say, deists, which means that God is a great clockmaker, so to speak. God created the world, created natural law, and then left. And then everything runs by itself, sort of. Christianity then is revived in the early 20th century in the United States and also in Europe, although I'm not going to make a dogmatic pronouncement about Europe, by Pietism, which is a new form of Christianity, I think brand new, through the revival movements, which we're now fairly familiar with. Those days it was a big new thing, where you arrive at Christianity through a mystical experience, through emotional mystical conversion, with revival meetings and rolling on the floor, speaking in tongues and so forth and so on. When you're born again, when you need not just a regular baptism, but another baptism, the baptism of the Holy Spirit, a second baptism becomes necessary. With this new form of postmillennial pietism, swept Protestantism, almost taking over almost completely, especially in the North, especially in Yankee country. I define Yankees as being a cultural group who were originated in rural New England, not so much Boston or the cities, but rural New England, rural Connecticut, Massachusetts, etc., and then emigrating. They were big migrants, emigrating westward into upstate New York, western New York, northern Ohio, this famous Western Reserve area, northern Ohio, northern Indiana, northern Illinois. Okay, this is Yankee country. And the Yankees were always compulsory conformists. One historian called Yankee imperialists. They wanted to crush all dissent, one form or another. It was the Yankees who were the originators of the public school system in the United States, for example. Force everybody in the public school and teach them the correct doctrine. So the Yankees took to this like a duck takes the water, this new form of pietism. Essentially, the new form of pietism was as follows. Creeds are not important. Whether you're a Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, doesn't make any difference. It's all interdenominational, as long as you're a Christian. Law is unimportant. The Bible is unimportant. The key thing is sort of personal relation with God. And this is, by the way, the origin of the YMCA movement, all these interdenominational movements, because divisions between churches, between Protestant churches are unimportant. Each individual then is sort of naked to his creator. In other words, his personal relationship with God and man. And the church is unimportant too. And whether you're a church member is really unimportant. Which church you belong to is unimportant. And the Yankee wing, which is called evangelical pietism, different from the Southern pietists, became sort of quietist types. You try to achieve your born-again conversion, and that's it. You don't bother anybody. It has no political implication. Evangelical pietists believe as part of the pietism that you can't be saved unless you maximize the salvation of everybody else. Key. In other words, it's not just you like to have a missionary thing and try to bring everybody else the word. It's more than that. It's your divine duty, otherwise you won't be saved, to try to maximize everybody else's salvation. So in order to do that, in order to maximize everybody's salvation, you have to eliminate sin, occasions for sin, and so forth and so on. Okay? And so very quickly, of course, they became big statists because they used the government as a sort of a shortcut to stamping out sin. And you try to create the conditions of this to save these individual souls by hoping them by stamping out sin. And so what you have from the very beginning of pietism, from 1830s until 1920s, really, I mean, from the whole 19th century, you have a situation where all these guys were constantly spending their time trying to outlaw sin on the local and state level in the United States, meaning anything which interferes with your theological free will. These were theological free willers, so that anything which clouds your mind, so to speak, and interferes with your free will should be outlawed. This meant in practice demon rum, number one, liquor. Liquor is evil. They broadened the definition of sin. There's one Catholic opponent of this said they made sin what God did not. Okay? So anything liquor is sinful because liquor clouds your mind, interferes with your theological free will. Liquor is evil. Anything on Sunday except going to church is evil. It must be stamped out. So drinking liquor on Sunday is how the ultimate evil. It's like a double whammy. Okay? There's nothing more sinful than drinking liquor on Sunday. And the third thing, of course, is the Roman Catholic Church, where everybody's enslaved or agents of the Vatican, and the Pope is the Antichrist. So the idea is to stamp out liquor, stamp out Sunday activities, and stamp out Catholicism. Now, they couldn't stamp out Catholicism directly, constitutionally. They try their best. They try to restrict Catholic immigration in various ways. And once they said, well, the adult Catholics are doomed. But you get the kids. There's a famous cry of the Pietists was, Christianize the Catholics. And the way you do it is get the kids in the public school system. Prevent parochial schools, outlaw parochial schools. Get the kids in the public school system, then Protestantize them, or pietize them. And so the whole public school system, the real thrust of the public school system was pietists, was Protestant pietists. All these guys I've hated for years, like Horace Mann, the whole public school movement, their real motivation was pietist. They wanted to get these guys, want to crush the Catholics and the Lutherans, who were the German Lutherans in particular, who were formalists or liturgical Christians. And you get them by getting the kids in the public schools and Protestantizing them. In many cases, in many jurisdictions in the United States, for example, you could not be a public school teacher unless you were a Protestant church member. This is going on the local and state level for 100 years. What happens is that the Catholics, as they come to the United States, and the German Lutherans that come to the United States, are horrified. First of all, the Germans, both Lutheran and Catholic, have a marvelous custom, a charming custom. After going to church on Sunday, the whole family repairs to a beer garden with a brass band and so forth. And here they are sitting in a beer garden, minding their own business. These wasp fanatics descend upon them. Sin, double sin, crush, kill. So this conflict is going on at local state level for 100 years. I mean, these guys are hopped up. So what you have then is the party system that develops in the United States until 1896. From 1830 to 1896, the political party system is a one-to-one correlation between pietists versus liturgicals. In other words, those who believe the church is, the importance for salvation is the church, joining the church, obeying the law, the sacraments, or whatever. Right? There's total conflict here. The liturgicals consist of Catholics, German Lutherans, and old-style Calvinists, by the way. Those who were left, who hated the revival movement and the pietists, became allied with the Catholics. And so what you have a political party system with a one-to-one correlation. The Whig Party and then the Republican Party was straight pietists. And the Democrat Party was liturgical. And never the twain met. And so what you have is a total fantastic ideological conflict between Republicans and Democrats. Everybody hating each other's guts. And there were no independent voters, no floating vote. No Democrat would ever vote Republican and vice versa. What they do is, if your guy wasn't militant enough, he just didn't vote. He just stayed home. And usually elections are very close. And so the idea in the campaign is not to sell out the appeal to the alleged independent vote. The idea is to be as militant as possible to get your guys to vote. And so in the campaigns, the politicians were even more hardcore than they were the rest of the time. So it must have been a wonderful world to live in. And the thing is, the way it works in economics is that these guys, the economic creed was sort of a generalized consciousness from the religious creed. In other words, the Republican leadership and the Whig leadership would tell their people, look, just as you need big government on the local level to stamp out sin and liquor and dancing and things like that, in the same way you need government on the economic national level to stamp out cheap foreign products and cheap foreign people and increase purchasing power by inflation, by printing more money and so forth and so on, and high tariffs. In other words, there's a direct relationship between the big state and the national economic level and the local level. In the same way the Democratic leadership, or all laissez-faire liberals, will tell their people, look, the same WASP SOBs are trying to outlaw your liquor in your parochial schools are the people trying to keep out cheap foreign products and special privileges and decrease the value of your savings through inflation. And so this is how people got hopped up. This is why I have illiterates writing books and pamphlets on gold and silver and banking. I can't get my own students interested in this stuff. There's people writing pamphlets. They're all hopped up. The reason they're hopped up is the original religious motivation, you say. In this situation, unfortunately, one of the black moments in American history came in the Democrat Convention of 1896, when the Democratic Party, the great liturgical, known as the Party of Personal Liberty. By the way, the Democrats were known as the Party of Personal Liberty, both of themselves and other people. And Republicans were known as the Party of Great Moral Ideas. And so the Democrats in 1896 were taken over by the extreme pietists, one of the cataclysmic events. By various reasons, by that time the South, which was always, of course, Democrats since the Civil War, the South had become, Southern pietism was transformed into prohibitionism and evangelicalism, which it had not been before. And the mountain states were created. You know, can you imagine how many people there were in Idaho? There are no people in Idaho now. Can you imagine how much there were in 1890? These states, these phony states were all created by the Republicans. They knew they were pietists. Most of these people were pietists and they vote Republican. And within the Democratic Party, they were pietists. And so Bryan, one of the most evil people in American history, William Jennings Bryan, was able to form a coalition between the Southern pietists and the Mountain pietists to take over the party and kick out the liturgicals. At which point the whole laissez-faire movement drops out. In other words, the Democratic Party had been the political embodiment of laissez-faire and libertarianism, liberalism. There was now no longer any political party to reflect this. Both parties were now pietists, more or less. And so this left a power vacuum for experts, intellectuals, progressives, etc. to take over. Results we all know. This is a lead in to a couple of these progressive intellectuals I can't ignore, both philosophers and economists. Progressive movement was a pure pietist movement. As a matter of fact, everybody whom I detest was involved in this thing. The Progressive Party Convention, for example, 1912, which is not the only progressive movement. They were the extreme versions. Teddy Roosevelt, who was an old-time progressive, began his career as police commissioner in New York, smashing saloons. In this group consisted of the following people, Progressive Convention. Morgan Partners, who are extremely important. I can't get into all that. Morgan Partners, J.P. Morgan Partners, pietist ministers, social workers, intellectuals, economists, political scientists, social workers, shrinks. I mean, almost everybody you can think of was involved in this thing. Roosevelt's acceptance speech was called a confession of faith, and in his speech was punctuated by hymn singing, pietist hymns, follow, follow, follow Jesus, where they substituted the word Roosevelt for the word Jesus. Amen. And finally, Roosevelt wound up his famous peroration by saying, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." So there's fantastic religious pietist imagery here. What you have is all these guys, all these progressive intellectuals, from John Dewey, Richard T. Ely, all these people, every one of them, it's bing, bing, bing. They all grew up in pietist homes. They're all rural New Englanders or rural New Yorkers, whatever, all Yankees. Usually their father was a preacher or the mother was the daughter of a preacher. They usually kept a very strict Sabbatarian home. Nothing was done on Sunday except the praying, etc. And they wind up, they have the post-millennial pietism in the gradual sense, not in the sense of killing everybody immediately, which we talked about before, but gradually, sort of evolutionary, where the government takes over and the government becomes God's major instrument. There's a great phrase which Ely repeats, and all these guys repeat. Ely was the founder of the American Economic Association, by the way, a great progressive statist intellectual. The phrase is, government is God's major instrument of redemption. Through government, through statism, through crushing liquor and bringing about equality and statism and government regulation and everything, the kingdom of God on earth is established gradually. And by the way, Ely thought it was going to be pretty fast. It wasn't so damn gradual. He thought about, in his lifetime perhaps, the kingdom of God on earth will be established by this method. Now John Dewey, of course, is a classic example of atheist or secular humanist, is little known to the fact that at the beginning of his life he was a Christian post-millennial pietist. In the 1890s he taught at the University of Michigan, he was pushing Christian sociology, etc., and taught in these terms. They see it was very easy for these guys to become secularists. After all, they said, well, we have the kingdom of God on earth, we'll establish through government. Pretty soon God sort of drops out. I mean, you got the government, why worry about God? You have a sort of gradual secularization, but post-millennials sort of die out. By 1920, they're all died out because they all become straight people we know and love, social gospel ministers and all the rest of it. I mean, people who are essentially non-theists.